Are you looking for people who are compliant, who need to be managed and motivated by other people? Or are you looking for people who are self-managing and self-motivated?
Fire, earth, wind, water. This is the Elemental Educator. And now your host, Tyler Como.
Hello and welcome to the Elemental Educator podcast. I'm your host, Tyler, and today we have a special guest that elevates educational and leadership expectations via powerful habits. Joining us is Mike Anderson. Mike has been an educator for many years, a public school teacher for 15 years. He's also taught preschool, coached swim teams, and taught university graduate level classes. He now works as a consultant, providing professional learning for teachers throughout the U.S. and beyond. In 2004, Mike was awarded a National Milken Educator Award, and in 2005, he was a finalist for the NH Teacher of the Year. In 2020, he was awarded the Outstanding Educational Leader Award by NHASCD for his work as a consultant. As a best-selling author, Mike has written 10 books about great teaching and learning. His latest book is Rekindle Your Professional Fire: Powerful Habits for Becoming a More Balanced Teacher. When not working, Mike can be found hanging out with his family, tending his perennial gardens, and searching for new running routes around his home in Durham, New Hampshire. Welcome to the Elemental Educator podcast, Mike. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I'm so excited for a fun chat today.
Absolutely, me as well. Mike, your extensive experience in education has always been guided by core values. How do these values shape the professional development programs you create for teachers across various educational settings?
Boy, it's such a great question to start the conversation with. I think one of my core values is that both kids and teachers want to do great work. I really firmly believe that all kids want to do great learning, want to grow and learn, even when they tell us they don't. I don't believe them then. I really think all kids want to do well. And I think all teachers want to do well. And so the work that I do is all about helping to bring out those good intentions and sometimes helping to remove roadblocks that both kids and teachers face when they're trying to do that good work. So that's one of my real core values that guides just about everything I do.
I love that. And did that core value steer you into education in the first place, or is that rooted somewhere else?
So if I'm going to be really honest, what really steered me into education was something much more basic, which was that I just really enjoyed working with kids. When I first when I first started working with kids, I knew I wasn't going to be a teacher because my mother was a third grade teacher. My dad was a college professor, so there was no way I was going to be a teacher. And then I
Mm-hmm.
started teaching after school swimming lessons at the Auburn Lewiston Y in Auburn, Maine, where I grew up, and started working with 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. And I was like, oh, this is fun. So that's what actually brought me into education. It was something much more basic, which was just joy. But it was once I got in and really started doing the work that I started to develop some more sort of core values around what I wanted that good teaching to look like. And I would say that was a belief that sort of formed in the first couple of years that I was in the classroom.
Now, I want to unpack that just a little bit more before we keep going. What made it fun?
Oh, I love the energy of young kids, especially I love working with learners of all ages, but especially that range of 8, 9, and 10, which was the age I started teaching swimming lessons to, and then pretty much the age I worked with in the classroom. I taught third, fourth, and fifth grades for 15 years. Just love that sort of sweet spot of childhood with that age where kids can do so much. Their language is so developed. They can read and write. They've got funny senses of humor, but they haven't hit the sort of storm of adolescence yet. So they're still real. And so I just love that energy and that sort of vibe, that sort of late little kid stage, I guess you could call it.
When I hear that, it sounds like we're dancing around the general idea of just you love the opportunity you can bring them and the instant excitement that you see from the opportunity provided. So I'm not surprised that maybe deep down in there is a core value root around giving opportunity to the others, and giving opportunity to the youth is what kind of started it, because it was fun. It felt rewarding. It looked cool. And to see the joy in other kids as they got exposed to things that you shared with them, there's something powerful about that.
Oh, absolutely. That's part of the energy that I love so much is when you see young kids learning something new and trying something out and then having some success and seeing themselves get good at something. That's just such a powerful thing to be able to share with another human. Is
Yeah.
that of learning? Yeah, absolutely. That's big part of what drew me in. and keeps me
Yeah.
going.
Some of the most crucial moments for me, not just with kids, but with my staff and people around me, is moments of mistakes, because I learn so much about the space I've created. When a mistake happens, how do I respond? How does the person that made the mistake respond? And what does that look like? Because we can't learn if we're not making mistakes. And so it's creating that space. And so if you have fun and you have joy, you also have a space where when something goes wrong, people still feel comfortable to try again. And that's really important.
That's so important. And it's something I talk to teachers about all the time is the importance of valuing mistakes and expecting mistakes. And I think sometimes as educators, we're really good at telling kids we expect you to make mistakes, mistakes are good. But I'm not sure we always actually follow through on that or
Yeah,
live.
exactly.
And one of the ways I see a huge disconnect is I think educators are really good at accepting kids' academic mistakes. If they see a kid who's reading and they stumble over a word, we're very quick to jump in and say, oh, that's okay, just try it again. We don't necessarily follow through is around kids' social and emotional learning development. Kids make mistakes with friendships, when kids make mistakes with impulsivity, when kids make mistakes with blurting or swearing. We often have a harder time as educators seeing that as a learning moment, as a growth opportunity. And we're more likely to react with anger or criticism when kids make social mistakes or emotional mistakes. And it's something I'm often trying to help teachers understand is the energy we bring to academic mistakes is the exact same energy we need to bring to social and emotional mistakes.
Not just teachers that need to work on that growth there. I think the entire community around the kid needs to work on that as well. There's been many conversations around what's the punishment? What are you going to do to discipline? And those are the biggest opportunities for someone to grow. The debate is there's still school divisions that have policies over suspending students over high absentee rates, and that's just going to make them not come anymore. So why are we going down this path? What can we be working towards? Now, I'm going to shift to maybe a quick transition here, because you mentioned about supporting teachers through some of these conversations, and in your book Rekindle Your Professional Fire, you discuss maintaining well-balanced teaching practices.
Hmm.
Could you share how core values play a role in helping educators stay balanced and effective?
Oh, absolutely. I think when when things are humming along and we're doing well as educators, it's often because what we do is aligned with our core values. When we find that our practices are in step with what we believe and how we want schools to look and feel, that's when we've got tons of energy as educators. But it's so hard to keep that going. It's so easy to end up in practices that don't align with our core values. And that's where we often feel disconnected from ourselves. It's often when we feel like what we're doing doesn't have the purpose that we're looking for. I can give you an example from my own teaching career. I remember early on, I was getting really frustrated with my fourth graders and how needy they were. I felt like I always had a line of kids waiting to ask me something like, Mr. Anderson, is this okay? Mr. Anderson, is this good enough? Mr. Anderson, do you like this? Mr. A, I broke my pencil. Mr. Anderson, I don't know what to. I was like, oh my gosh, can't you people think for yourselves? Is what I'm saying in my head.
Mhm.
But then what I realized, and it was actually a mentor of mine who pointed this out, is that the way I was reinforcing kids' behavior was through language that encouraged them to be dependent on me. So when I would praise kids, I would often say things like, oh, I love the way you're walking so quietly in the hallway. Or I love all the detail you added to the beginning of your story. Or thank you so much for remembering to push in your chair. So it's every time I praised kids, I was encouraging them to worry about what I was thinking and feeling. And then I had the nerve to get annoyed when they were always worried about what I was thinking and feeling. So it was a pivotal moment in my career where I realized, wait a minute, the language I'm using doesn't match how I want kids to feel. And so I really worked at shifting my praise to, instead of saying, I love the way you walk so quietly in the hall, to say, hey, you're walking really quietly in the hall. That's helping other learners in classrooms be able to stay focused. Or instead of saying, I love how you added all that detail to your story, I would say, oh my gosh, when you add all that detail to your story, it totally hooks in the reader and it makes people want to keep reading your story. Then my language was in line with my goals for kids and my purpose. And oh my gosh, my energy was so much better. That's just one little example. But I think one of the things that I often do with schools is help them recognize what are their shared values? What is the direction we want to go in? And how are we living that out? And where are we, inevitably, it always happens in every school, what are some of the practices that aren't in line with that? And how do we shift those practices to get them more in line? And that's one of the things that helps teachers stay fresh and energized in the profession.
Absolutely. And what you are saying resonates with me so much because my earth element that's within all of us is all about the root of our decision making. It's all about that alignment. It's all about that personal mission, that personal vision. Now, I'm curious. This is such a great message you're sharing about how we should be talking to kids to set them up for others would call just intrinsic motivation, other than the extrinsic motivation that they were getting. They wanted the praise, but now they're feeling self motivated to do those things because they feel proud of themselves. How do you establish that with teachers?
Could you be more specific with the what do you mean? How do I establish which part with teachers?
So you've talked about rephrasing how you word things to kids. How can that translate to how leaders should be talking to teachers?
Oh, I mean, like, where are the lights that are flashing right now on the screen? Because that's so important. And in fact, I was just out in Utah a couple of weeks ago delivering a keynote for 175 elementary school principals, all about effective language. And the first part of the talk was how do we help teachers better align the way they talk with kids with their core values? And the second part was how do we do that exact same thing as school leaders with how we talk with. So if we want adults driven by self motivation, curiosity, autonomy, purpose, then the language we use should reflect that. And I can give you a funny example of a time when there was a misalignment. I was working with a school in Connecticut back in the spring, and all the work we were doing in the school, and I'd been there a bunch, the work we were doing was centered around helping students be more self motivated. And I'd been observing in classrooms and working with teachers throughout the day, and then I was going to facilitate a staff meeting, faculty meeting at the end of the day. And the principal was calling people to order. And she said, okay, everybody, let's settle in. We know Mike is here to do the staff meeting. And the quicker you settle in, the quicker we'll all get out of here.
I bet you felt great.
I chuckled and I said, or the quicker we'll get to all of the awesome learning that we're going to do together this afternoon. And she said, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed. But it's so
Yeah.
easy for us. It's so easy for us to run on autopilot with our language. And sometimes even to talk like down to the few people who are at the lowest rung of where we want people to be. She knows there are a couple of people in that faculty who are probably looking at their watches and all they want to do is get out of here. And that's probably who she was really, without meaning to, talking to when she said that. She was trying to appeal to them to get them to quiet down. But the message she was sending to everybody else is this is just something we have to get through. And so I think it's so important that school leaders are really conscious of what are my goals? How do I want faculty to feel about whatever it is I'm talking about? And then how do I make sure my language reflects that? If I want them to be excited about the staff meeting, say, hey, we got some great learning to do together this afternoon. So let's go ahead and get settled in so we can get to it.
And it's so important that as a school leader, you take some time and you reflect and you actually establish. I keep throwing out in some of these recent episodes the non negotiables, things that you're not going to allow to be a part of conversations within your dynamics of leadership, right? You're not going to be talking about, oh, we can get out of here after this, because that's not appropriate. You want to focus on the learning. You want people to be excited about it. The staff room is not a place to go and complain about everybody's kid. Again, those should be some non negotiables that are happening in your school. Now, there are some things that principals don't have or teachers don't have control over on what they need to execute. Sometimes that's a direction given to them. And when that's against maybe what they want to even do with it, how do you help them navigate that?
Immediately, a story comes to mind. When I was teaching in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, teaching fifth grade, the city council in Portsmouth decided that all students should have to participate in the Martin Luther King Jr. essay writing contest. Now, I'm all in on Martin Luther King Jr., amazing human being who did incredible work. I'm not all in on kids being forced to participate in a competitive contest in which there's going to be one winner and 150 losers. And we had something happen the year before where a kid's mom had written his essay for him. And so he won. And then he got up in front of everyone to read the essay and he couldn't read it. So I was frustrated with this. But my principal's hands were tied. It was from the city council, which passed it to the school board, which kicked it to the superintendent, who kicked it to the principals. And so I went to my principal and said, okay, help me know, what should I not do? Because if we're going to do this, I can't assign this as homework because that's not fair. I've
Mhm.
got some kids in my class who just can't, they don't have space for homework. So help me understand what I shouldn't do over the next week or so. What should I cut out in order to be able to do this thing that we have to do out of a sense of compliance? And she didn't really like that question. But together we figured out how to carve out the 4 or 5 hours we were going to need in that week for kids to actually write a thoughtful essay. There are things we have to do out of a sense of compliance. Hopefully, most of our work is driven by purpose, but we all have elements of our work we don't want to do. That's true for kids, it's true for adults. When kids are writing a research paper, nobody likes to cite resources. It's boring, it's tedious, but you got to do it. And if it's in service of something you love, if it's in service of the research paper you're writing on Jackie Robinson and you really care about Jackie Robinson, you can find the energy to cite the resources. And I think sometimes as educators, we also have to recognize that there are things we don't want to do, but sometimes that's just part of the deal of being in a community of other people. And so sometimes we've just got to go ahead and find the good energy and do the thing. In the end, all my students submitted essays to the Martin Luther King Jr. essay writing contest, and it wasn't the end of the world.
What you're alluding to, within our earth element, if you're very rooted in it and you understand it, you can use it as a driving force behind adversity, and it can help get you through our air element, which is when you're faced with adversity. And now a part of that is you've emphasized the importance of, at least in your book, the autonomy in teaching.
Yeah.
How do you advise school leaders to nurture this value among their staff while maintaining educational standards? Because to me, this sounds like we're now dealing with adversity.
Yeah, autonomy is so important. When you really dig into the literature in psychology about the importance of autonomy, it appears as though, at least according to Edward Dietschy and Richard Ryan, who have done some amazing work in self-determination theory and psychology, all about why we do what we do and what drives us, they contend, and they've got a lot of research to back this up, that without autonomy, be truly self-motivated. So without at least some power and control over what you do or how you do it, your motivation can't come from the self. You could be compliant and maybe even happily compliant, but if we're looking for teachers and kids to be really self-motivated, there's got to be some autonomy there. And in my mind, one of the most damaging impacts of the standards movement that we've had over the last 30 years in education has been the stripping of autonomy from teachers. When I first started teaching in the early 90s, probably teachers had too much autonomy. We didn't have, in the school I taught in, there were math books that were collecting dust on the backs of shelves, but nobody really used them because they were outdated and boring. And everybody was just making up their own math program. There wasn't a lot of consistency, often from class to class. The same with literacy. Everybody was teaching reading in their own way. And that was probably, there was too much autonomy there. But now we've swung a little too far in the other direction, where sometimes schools are buying programs for teachers and saying you have to use the program exactly as it is. The program is scripted with even words the teachers are supposed to use. We're told to use these programs with fidelity, which might be the new F word in education, in my mind. And so I think as school leaders, one of the things we have to help teachers do is find some autonomy within the boundaries of what we've got. For me, the sweet spot is we've all got an approach to teaching literacy, and we're being consistent in the approach. But then teachers have a lot of power and control over the decisions they make in the day-to-day teaching of the program. Or in math, maybe we all have a math program we're using, but teachers know that it's okay to skip one lesson if they know their kids just don't need it, or to teach 2 or 3 times if their kids need a little bit of extra work on that particular concept, or to take that lesson and say, you know what, I'm going to use this one part of the lesson, but we're going to play this game at the end because that's going to be a better way to reinforce the learning. And so I think maybe that's the sweet spot, is to help teachers be consistent. If you've got 30 different teachers all paddling in different directions in the lake in their own canoe, it's awfully hard for people to collaborate, and you can't harness the collective power of people's collective thinking. But if everybody is supposed to be running in lockstep and doing the exact same thing in the exact same way, in my experience, what that often does is it might elevate the teaching of some really lower skilled teachers, but it often it caps what great teachers can do. And it diminishes the good learning that good teaching can bring forth in kids. So I think that's sort of a long-winded way of saying this, but I think it's about balancing the need for consistency with autonomy.
Yeah, and you're tiptoeing the two extremes of having total misalignment to having imposed alignment. And the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle where there's just alignment. And I love using an example from where I am, which is in Alberta, Canada. And we have a program of study that is rolling out new curriculum, at least in elementary right now. And it's soon to roll out, I think, in junior high and then high school here. For anybody that's a phys ed teacher out there, one of the program of study outcomes in Alberta for phys ed is to assess locomotor movement. And They have other ones like send and receive objects and alternative environment. And they're very, what I would say, they're very vaguely worded. And yet, if you go and walk through maybe half of the high school phys ed classes in our province, we're still assessing the sport of volleyball, or we're still assessing the sport of basketball, and we're not assessing the outcome of locomotor movement.
Yeah.
And when you do it that way, and a new teacher comes in and they get the old information that the teacher before them taught and they see it the same way, what you're actually doing is you're having misalignment. And then if your principal is buying into that system, you're also having imposed alignment. And sure, you're moving in a direction, but we're limiting the innovation and the creativity that could be coming out. We are hindering that. Now,
Yeah, because
that's
volleyball and basketball are a means to an end, not the end.
exactly,
The end is,
exactly.
yeah, the end is the movement that we want kids to practice.
Yep.
So
And it doesn't need to be done in one class. It doesn't need to be done in one activity. And not every kid's going to be great in that one activity to show that they're good at locomotor movement. I know I've seen just about every kid in my school run, right? I've seen just about every kid in my school skip and turn and twist. Maybe it wasn't at phys ed. Maybe it was at recess during supervision, but maybe we're playing the wrong thing to assess what we need to assess for those kids.
and something I'm often trying to help teachers consider is the power of giving students more choice, more power and control over what they do and how they do it. So you might have a unit that's all about locomotive movement and then let kids choose. Do you want to play basketball? Do you want to do volleyball? Or do you want to do, I don't know, a ropes course or some kind of obstacle course? And let kids pick one of those three activities, have three different stations. It takes a little bit more planning in the upfront for teachers. But often once you get going with that, it's not any more work. And if anything, it's easier because you don't have kids who are dysregulated because they're being forced to
Mhm.
do something that they don't want to do or that they feel incompetent doing.
See, I flipped it and did it a little differently when I was an educator in phys ed. I gave them the activity we were going to do. And then we had four general outcomes. We had activity, benefiting health, cooperation, and doing it daily for life. And I said, you can pick on this activity we're doing which outcome you want me to assess for you. And if you're somebody that is, I'm not good with the skill in this sport, show me you can cooperate. Show me that you can be a part of setting up and taking down, do it daily. If you absolutely want to fight over never doing it, do benefits health and write me something about how it's benefiting you. Right. That's totally fine with me. And I let each kid, it was a bit of work, right? And my class was 25 kids, but I let each kid pick which outcome they wanted to assess. I tracked it and I said, now that you've picked this one, the next one, you have to pick a different one. And we can come back and visit them, but you have to go through all four first. So here's our next four activities. Start thinking about which one you want to come for, and then let me know. And it went really well. I had a lot of buy-in. I had a really high participation rates in a school that was typically known for low participation rates in phys ed. And it was because they had choice, they had ownership, they were able to be a part of the alignment. Let me pose this question to you here. In your workshops and books, you often tackle the theme of overcoming motivational crises in
Hmm.
schools. What strategies do you find most effective in reviving motivation among teachers and students alike?
It's coming back to what we've been talking about a good bit already on this. It's about autonomy often. And the title of the book that I wrote about this is called Tackling the Motivation Crisis. It's a good title, but I actually don't actually think we have a true motivation crisis in school. I think we have a compliance crisis. I do think kids are different now than they were 10 or 15 years ago. And it would be weird if they weren't. Kids will be different 10 or 15 years from now than they are right. They're gonna keep changing because the world changes. I think that we do have kids in school now who are less willing and able to do stuff because they're supposed to. More kids 10 or 15 or 20 years ago were willing to go to school and slog through and do the school thing because it was the expectation. And whether it has to do with being raised with devices in their hands or social media or kids' attention spans or whatever. I'm so tired of blaming everything on COVID. We could go there too.
Or a different mindset too. I'm just going to jump in there and say the adults around them as well. The mindset was different around if they're not doing it, that's on them, right?
Yeah.
There's been a shift in that in the last 15 years too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in the end, I guess it doesn't even really matter why it shifted, but we've got to recognize that kids are not as willing and able to do stuff just simply out of compliance. But I don't think that humans' intrinsic motivations have changed. As a species, we're still driven by autonomy and purpose and a sense of competence and belonging and curiosity and fun. So for both adults and children, the work needs to have those things cooked in. I find that adults are more motivated in a professional development setting when the work feels purposeful, when it aligns with what they care about, and when they have some choice. When I can go in and work with a grade level team or a department team and say, how about we pick one unit that you want to play around with, and we'll think about ways to tweak that. And so we're giving some autonomy and ownership to the adults, just like we do the kids. Adults can be much more fired up and energized about doing professional development work when it's their work, when I'm there to help facilitate their thinking, as opposed to them feeling like they're there to do my thing. So for both kids and adults, I think if we want more self-motivation at school, then we've got to make sure that the work itself is worth doing.
This is a deep rabbit hole we could probably go down in a conversation here. What I'm picking up from this conversation and what's just really stuck out to me here is in a teacher's first 5 years, they're actually told no a lot by their administrators, by their leadership teams. There's been a shift as well where leadership teams are afraid to make mistakes because when they make mistakes, it blows up in the worst ways possible for them. And because of that, they've become hesitant to foster places of innovation and creativity. And just as kids are shifting, we are trying to confine teachers in a place that's not shifting as well. So I think part of that is on leadership here as well. We are creating spaces where when you're told no, or you shouldn't try this or don't do that so many times, it makes you stop trying.
Absolutely. And it's heartbreaking because when you think about the skill set that people need to be successful outside of school, it's often about creativity and innovation and making good mistakes and learning and growing. And it's almost like we're creating climates that run completely counter to the skill sets that people need outside of school to be successful. I'm reading a couple of books right now by Adam Grant, and I can't remember which of the two books that it was in, but in one of the books, he cites research that looks at how successful in the workplace are valedictorians. So someone has gone and crunched numbers to say, do valedictorians become leaders in their professions? And the answer is absolutely not. There's no correlation between people who are valedictorians and people who become leaders in the workplace, because traditionally, to be a valedictorian, you have to be really good at doing what other people tell you to do, really good at doing school traditionally. You do assignments the way teachers want. You nail all the points on the rubric. You're really compliant, and it's not compliant. I was doing a workshop at a school out in Los Angeles, and it was a group. I was actually doing workshop in the morning before school for a group of parents, and it was all about the language of parenting. And I asked the parents in the room, how many of you in your workplaces with the hiring process? And it was probably close to 75% of the hands went up. And I said, I'm curious, when you're hiring people for your organizations, for your companies, are you looking for people who are compliant, who need to be managed and motivated by other people? Or are you looking for people who are self managing and self motivated? And everybody laughed. They didn't even bother putting their hands up because everybody knew they're all looking for people who are self motivated and self managing. And it's the rare school, I think, that really fosters a climate where both adults and kids are truly free to take risks and make
Yep.
mistakes and have that be part of the learning culture.
And I hope you followed up that question with, okay, now that you've all agreed to that, let's see how you actually go about your new hire orientation. What does that look like? Because do you take that description that you just asked for and then try to put them into a cookie cutter model? Because that's
Mhm.
not going to work either. And that's where burnout comes in, because
Yeah.
you create imposed alignment and then people will go through compliance. Now,
Can I just
with
jump in and tell
consult,
another quick story
yeah,
that connects here? When I took a teaching job in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, when I was first hired there, I had been teaching for 6 years already, but I went to the new teacher orientation meeting. All the new teachers who were hired went to, and it was with the superintendent and assistant superintendent. And I'll never forget this message the assistant superintendent gave to us. He said, look, it's going to happen. There are going to be times when an administrator asks you to do something that you realize is probably not the best thing for kids. We have hired you because we believe that you will always do what's right for kids. And I remember sitting up a little straighter and being like, right on. I am all in with you, man. You just said that there are going to be times when I'm going to have to not do what you tell me to do. I found it such an empowering message. And it's so rare. And that poor guy was then going for the superintendency, and the union drove him out because he was a little scary because he bucked convention. And 2 years later, he was administrator of the year in a neighboring district. But that's another story.
And that's again somebody willing to be vulnerable, foster innovation and creation, and that's where it can thrive. And people people bring you down not because they hate you, but because they're scared, they're anxious. That change is difficult, but change is the only constant. One of my favorite responses whenever even a kid or an adult comes to me with a new idea that sounds totally wild, and rather than just sit there and say no, that's never going to happen, okay, yeah, let's sit down and see how we can make that work. And then usually through seeing how we can make it work, we realize it's an impossible request.
Yeah.
And then we get our answers, but it puts it back and it drives their mindset. And that's the important part is whose agenda do you push? Because as a leader, you can't push your agenda. You have to push the agenda of those around you and try to align it. Now, with your consultancy work, it involves guiding schools through changes in teaching and learning practices. We're on the theme of air. We're tiptoeing that dance with air and water, where water gets into change dynamics and fluidity and change. What is your approach to ensuring these changes are embraced and sustained by the school community?
Oh, it's so interesting being an education consultant and working in so many different schools and districts because I see so many different approaches taken to professional learning and change. And in my experience, there are a couple of factors that can lead change to happen. And what's hard is that as a consultant, there are often factors I don't have control over. One is internal leadership. So as a consultant, I can come in and bring some fresh ideas and offer resources and give strategies. And I can even go in and demonstrate practices for teachers and foster really great discussions and planning sessions. But without a leader in the school who's going to drive the work forward, there's just so far that my consultancy can bring teachers. And I remember a few years ago, I was working in a district in Massachusetts, and there were 4 elementary schools in the district. And we were all doing similar work across the district. It was all about using student choice as a way of differentiating learning. That was the focus. And the 4 elementary schools were relatively similar. Their demographics were similar. One of them was a bit smaller than the others, but they were all relatively small schools, 300 kids or less. And in one of the schools, the work flew. Teachers did incredible work, and they ended up co-presenting with me at a national conference in Boston because the work that they had done on student motivation was so rich and powerful and had led to such incredible change. And in one of the schools, it went nowhere. And the big deciding factor there was leadership. In the school where the work flew, the principal sat down with the teachers with me on my first day and said, I need to be the lead learner here. I need to
Yep.
make sure I'm understanding this work because I can't lead it if I don't understand it. So I apologize if I ask too many questions, but I really need to know this. And in the school where it fell flat, every time I walked in the front door, the principal walked out. Oh, sorry, I've got a meeting across town. Oh, sorry, I've got a dentist appointment. Every single time. And the work didn't go anywhere because the teachers have anything to sustain their work between my sessions. It became something they did when Mike showed up, but it wasn't
It's
something that.
also That's also an implicit message around back to our very first conversation. Hey, we just have to get through this. If your principal is not willing to walk hand in hand with you and they're not willing to be an instructional model here, they are implicitly saying you just have to get through this. They need to be able to sit there and go through it with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The second factor that makes a huge difference is about time. And it's not as much about quantity of time, it's about frequency. I have taught week-long summer workshops, 4.5, 5-day workshops where we go nonstop for 5 straight days. And those are energizing and awesome and fun and great. And people feel like they're drinking out of a fire hose. It's too much content all at once. And the amount that they can implement is often very little. In my experience, the best professional learning happens in a small drip method where we do a little bit of work together and then teachers have time to go implement and try things out. And then they develop questions and they can talk about what worked and what didn't work. And then we come back together again and do a little more work together again. So the best work that I do in schools happens when I get to come to a school 5 or 10 times a year and work with small teams of teachers for short amounts of time. 45 or 60 minutes at a time is enough for us to talk about a strategy for them to try, go in and implement it, and then come back 3 or 4 weeks later and talk about how it went and what they want to try next. And so the work that really goes places has leadership where I'm there to support the leader. It's not the thing that we're doing when Mike Anderson shows up, but I'm there to support the school goals driven by the leader. And we've got enough time and frequency of visits that teachers can wrap their heads around small moments of change and do that over and over again.
And that's a testament to all the research that says one time professional development does not work. You need to be consistent in it. And that 5 day workshop, the reason it's not as effective is it's essentially a one time professional development session, just
Yep.
crammed into 5 days. Now, if that's spread out over the span of a year to 2 years, it's probably a lot more effective.
We wouldn't do that to kids, I hope. We're going to cover biology in 5 straight days. We're going to go from 8 to 3, and by the end of the 5 days, you've mastered biology. We know that wouldn't work, but we do it to teachers all the time.
Now, implementing this change, it involves reshaping school culture. How do you align new initiatives with existing school values and culture of a school?
We talked about this a little bit earlier. Part of what we have to do is make sure that we're clear about what our culture is. And oftentimes, schools will have a mission statement written somewhere. You can see it hanging on a wall somewhere, either at the entrance of the school or near the cafeteria. There will be a mission statement with maybe a few bullets underneath it. And if you ask people, what's the mission statement of your school? Nobody can tell you because it's not a living, breathing document. It's not something that people are using all the time. It was something that some committee cooked up 10 years ago and now it's just hanging on the wall. Part of what we need to do is make sure we're coming together and at the beginning and saying, what are the values that are going to drive this work? What are our positive beliefs that we want to be steering what we do? And if a school has already a really vibrant working document, a working set of beliefs, then to make sure we're being clear about how what we do fits with our why. Us
Yes.
aligning the what with the why. And if the why is not clear, it's really important to spend a little bit of time digging into the why. I know as an educator, I am not interested in learning what something is or how to do it if I don't think it if it doesn't connect with my why. I need to
Mhm.
know the why in order to move forward with the what and the how. So investing a little bit of time early on in the process in uncovering the why and being clear about the why can then really help people move forward with the what and the how.
You sound like a Simon Sinek fan to me. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. I love that quote by him. And
He's done
you
great work.
talk Yeah, he has. Yep. And you talk about living your mission and vision, and you have to, even if it has just been something on your wall for the last 10 years, that should be a piece of reflection over the summer here around or into your first day of school or into tomorrow, even wherever you are in your school year. What is your school's mission? What does that look like? How do you live it in your classroom? And are you living it? And how can you make that a part of daily conversation? Because that's where alignment can come from.
A really simple way and a school leader could do this is, let's say there's a new initiative coming along. Let's say a lot of schools I'm working with are using the building thinking classrooms work in mathematics. And it's wonderful work. It's so well aligned with a lot of the work I do. So here's a simple thing a school leader could do is to pull out that mission statement or those values that we say we work toward and introduce the building thinking classrooms. Okay, everyone, we're going to be working with this approach to teaching mathematics this year. You're going to get a brief overview of the building thinking classroom so you know a little bit about what it is. And then we're going to go into our mission statement and identify where this connects. And
Exactly.
even a 5 or 10 minute conversation at table groups with faculty where they get to talk about how does what we're already hearing about the building thinking classrooms connect with our positive values and mission statement. What a simple but powerful thing that is to do. And it's so easy to skip it because we're so pressed for time that school leaders just want to dive into, okay, here's what we're going to do and let's move forward. We're going to implement this thing. Boy, do you lessen its impact if you don't step back and take a little time to make sure you're connecting it with people's purpose.
And the leader might have the connection, but they have to remember that their teachers might not, their students might not. So even though it's there for them, it's not there for others. And that's actually one of my favorite things to work with teachers on is whenever they have these new ideas, whenever they want to do these things. It's a non-negotiable for me. You need to tell me how this aligns with our mission because that's our earth. When we talk about what we're rooted in our school's mission. We're rooted in our guiding values. We're rooted in our vision. And every decision you make in your building, you need to root back to it. Why do you have awards night? How does that root to your mission? Why are you going on this field trip? How does it root to your mission? Why are you choosing to teach this in your classroom? How does it root to your mission? And if you don't have the answers for those, that doesn't mean that they're not there. It means that you haven't given it thought. And you just need to give it some thought around the intention behind the connection. And that's where the alignment's coming from.
So important. And like you said, it's so easy for administrators to forget that teachers, when I was a classroom teacher, I would so often get lost in the weeds. There were so many things for me to think about. And I was juggling so many different balls all at once that when a new initiative came along, I sometimes didn't understand how it fit into the bigger picture. And the school leaders did. But as a teacher, I needed a reminder. I needed somebody else to say, hey, here's how this fits into our big global mission. And then I could be like, oh, it is integrated. It does fit. This does make sense. Now I see the connection to the whole. When we don't do that for teachers, that's often when we get teachers complaining about, oh, here's one more thing coming along. Here's one more initiative that we have, because they're not necessarily seeing the forest for the trees.
And it becomes a pile on a pile on a pile on a pile on. What we need to do is actually just teach the framework that everything slides into, and then we're set. Then it doesn't feel like an add-on.
And
So
keep coming
what
back to that framework over and over again.
absolutely. We've talked about some of the changes we can see, and now we get to tiptoe that fun dance between water, air, earth, and it's all of its connection to the fire element, which is our decision making process, which is our risk taking, which is our passion and motivation. It's what's driving us to have excitement. It's rooted and guided through our earth and the rest of the elements, but it's really that piece that ignites where we want to go. And you advocate for innovative teaching methods amongst all teachers that you get to work with. What risks do educators need to consider when introducing methods like project based learning, increased student choice, trying to improve autonomy?
So it's interesting. It's such an interesting question, because I actually think that teachers are usually too good at considering the risks already. And that's what holds them back, is that they hyper focus on, if I give kids choice and they choose not to do anything, or what if I let kids do a cool project and they do a crummy project. And so what I'm often doing in those instances around project-based learning or choice-based teaching, using choice to differentiate learning, is to help teachers have a little bit more faith in kids and to not worry about the risk so much. Go ahead and try it and see how it goes. And so often teachers will come back and say, you know what? I was really surprised. I gave kids choices and not all of the kids chose the easiest thing. In fact, a lot of them chose things that were harder than I thought they would have picked. And I was really surprised. So I'm actually often encouraging teachers to tamp down their worry about risks and go ahead and try something and see how it goes. 'Cause I don't
I'll
know if
share a
that
little
really.
story on this actually. Yes. I raise a lot of eyebrows when I tell people that I always give kids an option to write a unit test or complete a unit project. And I said, if they choose to write the unit test, it's cookie cutter format. It's the best test I can give them that shows that they understand the outcomes that they're doing. If they choose to write the project, they actually get quite a bit of days to work on the project. They can choose how they submit it. I tell them what they need to show me, and how they submit it is up to them. I've gotten videos, PowerPoints, essays, a rap song written, right? Like you name it, it's come my way. And at the end of it, the kid goes, that was way more work than the test. I should have just did the test. And then the next unit comes and I say, do you want to write the unit test or do the project? And they pick the project again. And we have the exact same conversation. And then they go to write a final exam, which is mandatory, and they excel on it because they've been working with the outcomes, they've been applying them, they've been analyzing them, and they didn't just study cram in those 2-3 days that we do our professional development and then write something and forget. They worked on this for a week to 2 weeks at a time, consistently each day during their class period while everybody else was studying. And we build progress that way.
I love the thought exercise. I've given this to a couple of different, especially when I work with high schools and I'm working with teams and we're talking about an assessment and all that stuff. I'll say, all right, imagine this. A school leader makes an announcement that for an entire school year, nobody in the school is allowed to give a quiz or a test. How else would you figure out what kids know and what they can do? And that elicits such interesting conversation. And the teachers come up with all those projects that you just said. And I think that sometimes quizzes and tests are easy for teachers and easy for kids. Safe, they're familiar, and they're comfortable, but we know that they don't actually lead
Yeah.
great learning.
And they're anecdotal, right? They're very black and white. And the conversation, it scares teachers when I go up to them and say, can you just talk to the kid about the outcome? And if they can do it, how come you can't assess that they understand it? Why does it need to be written down in a test, presented, stood up in front of people? That's not the outcome.
Sometimes teachers are worried that what happens if a parent comes to me and says, where did you get this grade? And the test feels very concrete. And so what I often say to teachers, in because I often give the exact same suggestion to teachers that you just gave. Is what if you sit down with a kid and you talk to them and they know it and they can do it. So keep a running record where you jot down a couple of notes about what your conversation was, and then you put a date on the note that says, here's when I had the conversation. There's your record. There's the information that you need. There's your data that you can go back to if you're questioned on where that grade came from. But yeah, why is it that we so undervalue our professional judgment when it comes to anecdotal conversations? And we somehow
That's
think that
part of
we're
it.
in
Yeah.
control when tests come along. Because guess what? We make the tests. And when we make the tests, there are biases in there. And everybody's got their own rationale for how they build a test. Some people will intentionally put questions on a test that are harder than the standards because they're trying to separate the A's from the B's. That's a silly bias that we've cooked in that often then negatively impacts how we assess kids and whether we show whether or not they're reaching standards or competencies.
It's also not assessing the standard that you're obligated to teach. As soon as you say, I'm going to make a harder question, this is a debate I have with people all the time, because when we talk standardized testing, one of my favorite conversations to bring up is, let's look at the question, let's look at the standard, and let's look at the Bloom's level each thing is asking. So if the standard is asking a low level Bloom's, but the test is asking a high level Bloom's, that's the same goes on the flip side though, right? If it's a high level standard and a low level Bloom's question, you still have misalignment, and there's higher chances that kids are getting those standard questions wrong because they were misaligned with what the teacher was supposed to be trying to cover with those kids.
Another classic example of this is I've worked with a bunch of schools that are working toward moving to competency-based report cards, and they will often a 0 through 4 scale or a 1 through 4 scale, where the 3 is meets the standard and the
Yeah.
4 exceeds the standard. And that exceeds the standard is so problematic
Yep.
because now we're assessing things that are out of line with the standard and the competency.
And that number is problematic, I would say, too. That 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're just going to take that 3 divided by 4. Oh, my kid's 75.
That's right.
Yep.
Or they just say a 4 is an A, a 2 is a B, a 3 is a C. Yeah, it's a problem. But to your point, one of the biggest problems is that we're now, if we have a 4 on the report card, we now have to 4s along the way, and we're now
Yeah.
trying to find out which kids can do more than the standard, which is not aligned with our competencies that we've got.
I am so happy that where I am, they've recently changed how teacher evaluations are done, where there's no longer a column for exceeding standards.
Right on.
It's not meeting or it's meeting.
Yep.
And that's the way it should be. That's the way that sets people up for success.
We should do the same thing with kids.
Absolutely. Mike, the time has flown and it's gotten away from us here. I have a couple questions left for you.
Sure.
I guess one of my last questions here is, what are you hoping people action in their lives tomorrow from your message?
I guess I hope that people maybe pause and reflect on, why am I doing what I'm doing? That's something that I'm often trying to help teachers think about, is what's the purpose or what's the goal behind the practice that you've got, whether it's the way you assess or whether it's the way you talk with kids or whether maybe it's how you design a lesson. How does what I do flow from what I believe? And so if people have listened to this conversation, maybe that's a takeaway, is to examine some of those practices that especially have just become automatic and unconscious. I just do this because this is what I do every year. And to take a moment and say, okay, so does that actually align with my purpose? Does that actually connect with my why? And then maybe make some changes based on that.
Bring it back to your earth.
Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. What does your future look like?
I have no idea. I love what I do, but I didn't plan on being a consultant. This was not my goal 20 years ago. When I was a classroom teacher, I loved being a classroom teacher. And then an opportunity came along to work with a nonprofit organization. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm ready for a change. I'm ready to try something new. So I did that. And then things shifted at that nonprofit organization in ways that I couldn't follow. And I thought, I guess I'll try my hand at independent consulting. So who knows, 5 years from now, I could still be doing independent consulting work. I could be back working with an organization. I guess it still goes back to my why. If an opportunity comes along and it's exciting and new and fresh and aligns with my why, then I'm often willing to give a new opportunity a try. So who knows?
Mike, I think back to that story you first told when you were a swim coach and getting the excitement around the people over the things that you got to do with them. That so just came back to me right there in the moment of we're all that kid at heart and we all are rooted in that why and we all want to find that excitement and that opportunity. Now, with that, air is the toughest element because it is, again, it's that adversity, it's perseverance, it's pushing through. What advice would you give to anyone listening that's struggling with their air element, their adversity?
We all go through adversity. We all go through tough times. And when you're in the middle of it, that's often not what you want to hear because it can feel a little dismissive. But to remember that adversity is often temporary, it's often something we have to struggle through. And if we can turn it into a learning opportunity, if we can say, how can I take what's happening right now and grow and learn from it? It can be, like you said earlier, an incredibly powerful. I remember one time when I had a family who was really upset with something that I did. I used to play this game that I'd learned about through some professional development and read in a book. It was a game in which kids were basically able to give each other compliments and criticisms publicly in the classroom. It was an activity that we all sat in a circle and kids could go over and say, thank you so much for helping me with my math the other day. Or they could go up to a friend and say, you made me really mad when you pushed me on the basketball court yesterday. And I had a kid in my class who got hammered. He had been really rough to a lot of kids, and kids in that game hammered him publicly. What I didn't know is his parents are going through a divorce. And there was a reason that he was struggling so much. And the parents were furious with me because the kid came home devastated. And they spent an hour tearing me up and down. I'll never forget sitting in my classroom and realizing when they pulled out their bulleted list of all of the things I was doing that was wrong, thinking, ooh, this is going to be rough. And I just got to go with this and see if I can grow and learn from it. So I guess that's my hope, is that if people are facing adversity, if they can turn it into something they can grow from. I definitely learned from that experience and have been a better teacher because of that rough episode.
Thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable with us. Mike, how can our listeners get in touch with you and connect if they want to continue the conversation?
Sure. Probably the best way is through my website, which is leadinggreatlearning.com. A blog on there that I write somewhat infrequently, but there are all kinds of interesting blog posts there people could check out. There's a link to online courses I've created. People can check out my books there. They can learn a little bit more about my background there. So the website is a good landing spot for people who are looking to connect with me some more.
Thank you so much. And Mike, thank you so much for joining me on the Elemental Educator.
You're welcome, Tyler. This has been a blast. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
You've been listening to the Elemental Educator. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and X at Elemental Educator.